think? You're still here, so I'm guessing you approve. All right. Let's bring it back to filmmaker Douglas Tirola. Here he is. Give him a round of applause, please.
I didn't warn you that the credits were like Star Wars. Sorry about that.
Let's just start at the beginning. Where did your interest first begin in Bernstein's?
Well, there's two parts of it. The movie really begins when I'm researching a movie about New York in the 80s that I wanted to tell through the lens of an article by E.B. White, who most people know as the author of Charlotte's Web. He'd written an essay about New York in the late 40s, right around the time Bernstein would have started his career there. And I came across, one of these great moments of the 80s, and it was the concert you see at the end, not in New York, in Berlin, where Bernstein's playing, Beethoven's Ninth on Christmas morning, right after the Berlin Wall fell. And I think like a lot of people, whether you're a filmmaker or not, now you get interested and you look at you find something else on the internet. And next thing you know, you spend hours looking at things.
It's called a rabbit hole.
But I found myself interested not so much in the music, which obviously is great in his career on Broadway and at the Philharmonic, but in the politics of it. So after a while, I usually have a notebook I carry with me, and I write, and I started writing these quotes down of his. The first one being what you hear near the end of the movie when he's talking about his beliefs. I believe in people, and people can make mistakes and come back. And that was from something that he'd done with Edward R. Murrow, had a series, an interstitial series in the early 50s called This I Believe, where he had famous people and just everyday people write down their belief system in a short way. And then the thing about conducting, where he's talking about people say, you must love it when you point your baton and everybody does what you want. And he's like, no, I want us to breathe together. And he gives his philosophy. And I got to a number of these, and I went to my producer, who we've worked with. We've done 15 films together, including the ones I've directed. And I said, I really want to make this film about Leonard Bernstein. I'm sure she had never heard me say Leonard Bernstein in the 15 years we worked together, because I was aware of him. My mom loves classical music, and I come from one of these homes with lots of books, and my mom was the sort of person who would sneak into Broadway shows at intermission because she couldn't afford to go. But she worked for this wealthy woman for a number of years, who I think might even been on the board of the Philharmonic, but subscription to the Philharmonic. And she'd give my mom tickets, and I would go occasionally. And then the woman got divorced, moved to Arizona, and willed the tickets to my mom. So I had an exposure to him, but I was really more interested in these things about his thoughts about being an artist, about political issues. And so you find yourself, like the beginning of the movie and the end of the movie, when he's talking about the dates, that's from about an hour lecture about Beethoven, and that might be 3 minutes of it. So I was looking for most of what he's recorded talking about his music, but looking for these pieces where he ties it into really as his philosophy.
At what point did you realize you had the material necessary for him to be able to narrate his own story, rather than rely on people that knew him or talking heads or whatever, that you had enough material and interview material from him that you could take that approach? I love documentaries that are able to do that, and I'm wondering, but I always assumed that wasn't maybe necessarily the initial, that wasn't your first thought, but at what point did you realize you had what you needed to do that?
When we got invited to play here. No, no, I'm kidding. I've made a number of movies where you have interviews. I think a lot of filmmakers sometimes stay away from interviews or on-screen interviews because it's not invoked, comes in and out of how people feel about it. And I think sometimes that's the mistake. Sometimes you don't have to be an actor to be a movie star in a documentary. You just have to be good on film. So immediately we did go do some interviews, and it was helpful, but I was just like, there's nobody I want to see on screen or hear from more. He passed away in 1990, so most of the people who really contributed to his life are not available for an interview. His kids are, but what we were trying to explore, it wasn't that way. I didn't just want to hear someone who wrote a biography about him. So I then went and said, I want to have him tell this whole story. I think we can do it. He can talk to the audience. I found enough to convince the producer and the people who ended up financing the film. And I think sort of like a relationship. You're like, we're in love. This is awesome. It's going to be great. And then a little bit into it, you're like, how are we going to make it to the end of this? And it really became as I refer to it as it's going to tag sales, looking for something here and something there. There is no autobiography, audiobook. There is no David Frost 5-night interview. The two things that we came about that helped the most were when you see him in what hopefully you recognize as Carnegie Hall, when he's sort of talking to the camera and has all the colloquialisms about where are we now, and he's talking so intimately. Just like you see in the movie when he goes to Moscow and Berlin, and it's paid for by the State Department. People might remember or heard about in the 50s. That's very famously Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And that's essentially the government trying to say to the rest of the world, we're more cultured than you think we are. And by the 70s, those tours became documentaries. And so a person who's now in their 70s had made a documentary about Bernstein called Reflections that was only ever showed in Europe. And we got permission to use this. We found him. The family of Bernstein's family reached out and said, we want you to help the filmmakers. And so that became a big piece of it, where I think we knew we could get there.
Right. You brought up a couple things I want to follow up on, which is when you're going through the archives, as it were. Tell me about just some gems that you found that you didn't know were out there, or some surprises you discovered. Like, what were some of those? I just imagine like going through the archives of any artist that you are obsessing over to make a film must be like almost as fun as editing it together.
It is. There's some things where you realize you just need them. Just like you're doing when you are doing an interview. You go and do an interview and you hope you're going to get something you never heard of, but if you don't get this piece from this person, there might not be anybody else to say it. So there were certain things that we were looking for that we knew we wanted to say. I'd say some big finds were Harry Belafonte mentioning Bernstein, because there is no footage of Bernstein in Selma. There's 2 photos, and I think it's actually more significant. We don't need to hear Bernstein because we have him talking so much. We know his views on these things earlier in the movie with Louis Armstrong, but to hear Belafonte say, Sammy Davis Jr., Ozzie Davis, and then Leonard Bernstein, the fact he was invited might be more significant than he just decided to show up. So that was something. Then there's small things, like at the end of the movie when he just says, I love last lines and last thoughts. That's just great screenwriting on his part. Thank you. So you find that, and you don't even know you're looking for it, and you're like, we're going to put this to enter this last piece of it. So that was a fine. There's so many. We were looking for plot points. Something about where they took his passport away. Just different things where it would sort of be, we wouldn't be doing our job if they're not in the movie. They're the structure of the story. The letters were something that we did, especially the Aaron Copland letter, that was something that we didn't know we would find. With him talking about conducting was another piece of it. And Mike Walt, we knew about that 60 Minutes interview, but you don't know you're going to find him when he's asked about the Black Panthers, go, oh, please, and he delivers it. So, again, like just a great presence on screen.
You sort of alluded to it earlier, but I'm curious, like you mentioned, there have been other documentaries about him, and I'm wondering, you mentioned that part of it was about weaving his life through world histories and politics, but were some of the other ways you wanted to differentiate this documentary from maybe some that have come before, and probably many more that will be made going down? I want to say, this is probably the most personal I've seen any of these get, like really dig into both his marriage end his life as sort of this closeted gay man. And I'm just wondering, to your knowledge, is this as deep as anyone has gotten into that part of his life?
So far, I think it is. There was a film that came out, an American Masters, about him, or one of the better American Masters, I think, or better regarded. And it just too soon after he passed away, and so it was not being talked about, his relationship with men. You know, I think you could do a whole film just about that. Part of the challenge of putting the film together is when you make this decision to have him be the sole narrator of this, even though you hear a little bit here and there that were on tapes we found. If he doesn't say it, it can't be in the movie. So I don't want to talk about what's absent from the movie, but there's things that you were like, are we willing to live with not having, you know, something about a piece of music he might have made? The idea was that we saw these letters where he did talk about some of these things, but the choice was made to just have the letters deal with his relationship with men and his marriage. So it wasn't that we were using that as sort of this Band-Aid every time we don't have him talking. That should stick out, and we'll have it be in the letters because that's where he talked about it. He didn't do an interview, understandably, in his life about that.
We were talking earlier about this, but I think in documentaries that are about composers, I think it's fairly easy to illustrate how one composer is different than another by just playing the music. Conducting, though, I'm an amateur when it comes to classical music, but I had it around in the house, like it was in the house. My father was a huge fan, and I've never really understood what differentiates a great conductor from someone who isn't necessarily highly regarded. And that little bit of teaching at the end maybe gave me more information about that than I have ever had explained to me. Talk about his role as and I love that he's not just critical. He's also, when this young guy gets it right, he praises him as well. So talk about his role as an instructor and a teacher.
Well, I mean, he wanted to be a teacher. I mean, he was always teaching. I think if he didn't do what he did, he'd be a rabbi or a senator or in some ways. But you know, the film is personal to me. You know, he's saying things that I would never claim to be anywhere near as talented or articulate, but he was saying things that I was looking to try and say. And that's whether it comes to the politics of it or just the way his worldview and teaching. I went to school to be a teacher. I was gonna have I don't want to say that teaching's the easiest job, but like an English teacher, you usually don't teach Friday, right? There's no Friday creative writing classes at any colleges. It's like a 3-day work week and you have summers off. And so the idea of showing that he's teaching and doing this your work was something that, you know, I was trying to say in general, about teaching. I think the conducting thing is really about 3 pieces. There's teaching, the teaching scene that you see, and you do learn about conducting from there. What I think most people don't know what a conductor does. I would probably have had an answer that like anybody could come up with one, but he explains it. You have to know. It's like a sport. You have to be able to play every position. He has to know the most about it, and he's trying to inspire people about the music. I think what he did that changed conducting is he made it like the lead singer, lead guitarist of a band, where when he was first reviewed as a conductor in the late 40s, people were critical of him. Like, why is this guy jumping up and down and not being more stoic? But that performance, and then as the movie says, him making the music accessible to audiences by talking about it and turning and explaining what the composers were doing or what the orchestra was going to do, I think is his biggest contribution to conducting. The challenge has then been is there don't seem to be as many conductors that are as charismatic in the performance as him, and I think classical music's still looking for that.
I noticed you don't, if memory serves, you don't have that sort of obligatory montage at the end of the film with all of the news stories about his death. You don't really deal with his death at all directly. And I'm wondering, instead you just choose to end on, you know, another great performance. Why did you opt to sort of leave that part out?
You know, I can answer that by going back to the letters for a moment. So part of the justification of the letters, other than that they could serve this purpose of putting that part of his story there, is he talks so much, right? He's talking throughout the whole thing. So I love to eat and love food. And so we thought of those letters as sort of we were calling them an amuse-bouche, cinematic amuse-bouche for the audience to take a break. But part of the letters is that the audience has to read. I think it's like 7 minutes throughout the movie. I mean, we did have people working on the film saying you're going to have the audience read for 7 minutes. And my defense went back to another movie we made called Hey Bartender, where I learned, I didn't know that to be a cocktail you only have to have 3 ingredients: a spirit, some sort of mixer, and the third just has to be ice. If you think of making a movie or what you're putting on screen, that there's the visual, the cinematic language, and there's the audio. For me, the ice, so to speak, is the audience. And a lot of times filmmakers forget about, it doesn't just have to be we're giving you information in the most entertaining way. And so you're reading along with it. And so I think I'm thinking audiences want to be more participatory, and there's some things you don't have to explain. Does anybody think he's not passed away? And I wanted to end on this moment of him, you know, the last part of the last thing in the movie is, you know, him after they finish. And just if anybody's doubt, you know, I don't think anybody would, but it's 17 seconds long, because I one frame more and he starts to turn around. Obviously the audience isn't silent for that long. And that's where it's supposed to, where we want it to end, where it's this moment where he's reflecting on his life. Did he get to this apex of combining the symbolism of art and what he struggles to explain the whole movie and what he thinks art can do? And then hopefully the audience starts to think about their own moment. Everybody's gonna have a moment or moments of reflection. That idea really came from, in a wedding I was in, the person conducting the wedding said to the bride and groom, when you walk out the aisle, everyone's gonna be crying. Don't worry, they're not crying about you. These sort of things unlock moments in reflection on ourselves, just like a great movie should try to, you know, and that's what we're going for there. And to end that his message is still alive, not a traditional, you know, more like a script. The journey's more like a scripted film, even though it's a documentary, but it doesn't have to be born here, died then.
Speaking of the audience, I want to make sure you guys get a question. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it to you guys, so start thinking of good questions. Again, actually this question has to do with the crowd that would come see this. In any music documentary, I always think you have to make it for 2 people. You have to make it for the diehards, who applauded earlier, and then you have to make it for people who know nothing about the person, and you sort of have to convince them this is a person worth this time that you're about to invest in the subject. And so how do you, just talk about your philosophy about balancing those two?
That's a great question. And I think it's music docs, but anything where there's a really passionate, knowledgeable sort of fan base or supporters. And it goes back to what I was saying before the movie about the box sets, like when those first CD box sets, like Chuck Berry and Marvin Gaye and Led Zeppelin came out, there's that one disc that you'd almost feel like I was robbed if it's not in this film. Right. But there are going to always be people that know more about this subject and him than we do, and that might say, "Oh, why did you show that concert? You should have showed this other time he went to Berlin." And that's just the way you have to live with that. At the same time, like you're saying, how do you invite people to the movie who might have no knowledge? Maybe hopefully somebody said it's worth seeing, or they're brought to it. And so how do you give them that? You have to deliver some of that story where, I mean, I remember our consultant who was great, he was Bernstein's last assistant, and he works with the family. But there was something we had in there, and he's like, everybody knows that. And I'm like, there's nobody working on this movie because of their age. You know, the editor who did an amazing job, or the producer, the core group of it. I promise you, none of them they don't know this. It's news to them. And then it's trying to put it in a way where it's not slowing it down for people to know, or you know, I think in his case, because he's saying it and the way it's put together, hopefully even though they've heard it, you know, like going to a concert, maybe it's a different version than you've heard before. You know, I think people know about this moment when he gets his big break at Carnegie Hall. I don't think everybody knows about the, you know, changing the struggle with the changing of name when he gets that job. So you're trying to add something into it. But you're totally right. You have to keep both audiences in mind and be able to you know, the struggle is, I think when people say, why didn't you have this in there? But, you know.
All right, it's sort of hard to see everybody, but if anyone has a question, I see one over there. Go for it.
I'm a huge fan and know the story, but this was really brilliant and moving, first of all. To me, the best hidden gem was knowing that Nixon and Haldeman talked about masks. I thought that was wonderful. Well, my question is title. Because when you say wall, I think Berlin Wall, but I'm assuming there's more to it than that.
I first of all, thank you, and you're total. I mean, people have asked about that. I feel like the answer for me should be it's Rosebud or the briefcase in Pulp Fiction. Make it whatever you want it to be. You know, the idea was it originated with the wall, like the beginning of the movie, the Berlin Wall is going up and it's coming down. Not to go, sorry that I go far astray in answering these things, but you remember the book Primary Colors, Anonymous? And they tracked down who he was, the writer, because repetition of words in his other work or phrases. So he does talk about tearing down walls, you know, I would say frequently. And he does say, I think in the film, we cut it down to maybe 2 or 3 times, he says things about, you know, taking these walls down, people. So that's really what it came from, sort of his duality about certain things and these internal walls. But the original thing was that it was going to begin with the Berlin Wall going up and down. And I think one of his major philosophies is bringing people together and tearing down walls, whether it's political or prejudice in all its forms. But thank you so much.
Who else? There's 2 back here. Where's that? Okay, I see someone on the aisle there. Go for it.
So I'm not a fan at all of Leonard Bernstein. I actually didn't know much about him except for West Side Story. So this is a really great documentary, by the way. I love watching it. I'm curious, is the recent resurgence of Leonard Bernstein, like the new movie coming out called Maestro with Bradley Cooper, is there any it's always interesting when people that are that famous go viral in today's culture, get famous again. Is there a timing to that, or is that just coincidence?
You know, that's a good. Thank you for that question. He died in 1990, so there was and he was born in I think 28 maybe, or 1928 I think.
No, it has to be earlier.
Or 1918.
Yeah,
1918, sorry, 1918. So there was this centennial, which they took 2 years to celebrate. It started a year before his birthday, went a year after. There were 4,000 events. Some were huge, such the Grammys had a tour that went around the country, the Kennedy Center. So that started a little bit of it. I don't know. I think that the Maestro project, which might have been called something different before Bradley Cooper got involved, is something that had been kicking around for a long time. And then I think they got Bradley Cooper involved, and it had been rejected everywhere. And then Netflix said that they would move forward with it. The West Side Story is someone just came up with that idea. I know Spielberg. I think it was a passion project for him. We went to the family 5 years ago. So those projects we didn't know about those projects yet, and I've never wanted to ask the family or the LBO, the Leonard Bernstein office that does all these things on behalf of Bernstein's mission and music. You know, if we'd come after those 2 things were going to happen, if they would let us make this. Our version was a little bit different, but I think it's almost more of a business question. Does Maestro, someone say we'll do this because they hear Spielberg's doing the other thing? You know, one of my moments I'm happy about with our relationship with the family is when somebody said, "Hey, we can't forget about Doug's film because he wanted to do this just because he came to us because he had something he wanted to say with Leonard Bernstein." But I imagine there'll be more things in the future if those films are successful.
Was there someone else in that general vicinity? Go for it. Go ahead.
Hi. I love the movie and I love Leonard Bernstein. And I love that you chose to focus on the political aspects of his life and his activism. I'm wondering, is there anything that you not regretted, but sort of felt remorse about having to cut just by nature of this being sort of the narrative flow in regards to his activism and political life? Or anything that you wish you would have expanded on more?
Yeah, I mean, I have a version on my phone. If you're free after this, I could show you. No, I appreciate. There are some things. I mean, I hate to focus on what's not in the movie, but I'll give a big one to begin. Is On the Waterfront. He did the score for that, which is amazing, and you can actually hear some similarities in West Side Story. It's going on there, but he didn't talk about it. I think it was because he had had problems with the government, and then what happened with Elie Kazan, and so he just did not really talk about it where we could put it in the film. You know, there were some things to do later in life where he was pretty upfront, you know, vocal about AIDS and research and making people aware of AIDS. But it just, by that point in the movie, you get to a certain point and we're letting him speak so much that and there was nothing that great of him doing it. So that was something, though, that we struggled with. But hopefully his worldview, you know, would expect what that is. I think the one thing that we weren't, if I was doing a scripted movie and you could do whatever you want, there's a moment when he's starting to become famous and he goes on a tour in the late 40s of Europe and he plays a concert in Berlin, where he conducts a concert in Berlin with a symphony there. And it's very clear something he'd written and talked with about people that he's like, you know who's in this audience? It's like 1948. And so he goes out to a relocation camp where there are still Holocaust survivors from World War II waiting to be placed somewhere. And they get together 18 of these, you know, survivors who made their living playing classical music. And he put together an orchestra and they went and performed. The one song I know they performed was Rhapsody in Blue, which you hear in the film earlier, which was a go-to piece for him throughout his whole life. I feel that this moment, he didn't, there's not a lot of him talking about it. There's two photos. One is in the beginning of the movie in the sort of what we call the overture, with that opening. I feel that was a transformational moment for him where he starts thinking about what music and his work can do and this idea of where he's performing in this place. He was given a uniform that the prisoners in the Holocaust that he kept in a closet wore. So it was significant to him, but we couldn't find him talking about it, you know.
In the front here, yeah.
Oh, hi. Wonderful film.
Thank you.
I'm a student for a competition program. I'm just very...
Wait, a student for what?
Competition program, music competition. I'm very curious of this type of documentary that you have so many potential recording that you can use as you can just buy the license from the symphony, but you still hire a composer to score on it. And I have two questions. One is like how much percentage you will have source music that you can just use from BERNSTEIN'S old piece versus the music that's scoring on this film. And the next question is, what is the way you actually you communicate with Peter? Peter was my teacher, so I was so amazed because he's great, and because he can potentially he can just use 100% source music, right? So you still have that allowed to compose. Is that just in the transitional parts, when you talk and dialogue, you have those music there, or I'm curious?
Yeah. So the question, if you can hear, is basically how we're choosing the music that we we chose to put in the film, and that there is score in the film as well. So how did we use that, and how did that come to be? So the way we looked at the Bernstein music was in category. There's music that he wrote. There's music that, you know, and he performs or somebody's performing. There's music where he's performing on screen. In other words, so you know, we're married to, if we want to show Berlin in 1961, we need to pick something from that performance to show where he's on screen. So there were immediate things that you needed to have, and the West Side Story is in there, A Wonderful Town, New York, where we take it from the film because there's no recording, visual recording of the play. So one category is what is just music and then the other category is the classical music that he's just performing. You know, the Beethoven, Brahms, and so you're trying to figure out what you have to have in there, and, you know, because of what you're doing, and then we're curating other music really based on what we think is going to work, and, you know, using some of his music as score, like the piano pieces with the letters. So you know, a lot of people not everybody loves classical music, but they love it in movies. So if you ever seen Breaking Away, the music in that it's all classical music, and people, oh, I love it. Somehow, so he's trying to find music that we thought would make the film exciting or use it as score. When we got to a certain point, though, and some of it is better known if you're a Bernstein fan, some of it we went and searched for things that were less known. We were asking what is something that not everybody's gonna know that we've tried to get in there. But the music still needed, we still needed music to help just tell to go along with the cinematic language of the movie. So the stuff around Nixon and Kennedy is a big piece of that. There was one letter we didn't feel near the end when he's around the time Felicia he passes away. We just couldn't find anything, and Peter did something. The composer had a challenging job because it had to fit in the world of Bernstein, but it couldn't be a Bernstein sound-alike. So it's really Peter's music. Peter Golub, who did the score, it's great. It's mixed in there. It's at moments where we need some help that music can give you, telling a movie to dramatize what is happening. It's in a lot of the more serious parts. But then there are a few other things, like the klezmer. I don't know, I just, you know, when he's, you know, the dad's worried he's gonna have this world of trying to make a living as a musician in the arts. So there's this famous klezmer piece, but it's in the, and we had the recording of the most famous klezmer band, which, you know, and then you fall in love with it. Peter said, why don't we just record this? It's totally different type of music than the rest of it. So that's Peter's version of that piece, which is great, which allowed us to go buy some other stuff because it was easier as opposed to licensing that. But yeah, Peter Golub, he happens to be a professor at UCLA. He's also the head of the Sundance Institute music program. So he did a great job. He came in later, like a lot of composers aren't working through that. He came in later and he did an amazing job.
I think the best bit of this. I like his talk.
Yeah, he did great.
I think we have to get ready for the next show. Doug, I'm assuming you will stick around, and if people have more questions for you, you can
absolutely
find them in the lobby of the lounge. And thank you so much for bringing this film. Let us play this film. Welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back. Thank you guys for sticking around. Thanks a lot.